They've been swindled. They've been duped. They're stooges for and that's very unkind language, and I mean it to be so, because no one wants to be a stooge, basically a propounder, a propagator of a lie, a big lie. And when I say it's the biggest con of the 20th century, 21st century of our century, I mean that.
Hi, I'm Dr. Randy Bock, and this is the False Facts Fixed podcast, videocast, and I'm honored to have with me today Dr. Stan Ridgley. He's a professor in management at Drexel University, and one of the biggest false facts out there is essentially the background of DEI, and Dr. Ridgley is here with his book, DEI Exposed, and you know, it hasn't been pretty, one way or another, both in the application and potentially the undressing and the redressing of the DEI escapade. Dr. Ridgley, Stan, how did you get into this? Why you? And what is it? What has it been? You know, you call it the greatest grift, I guess, or the greatest scam. What do you call it?
I call it the greatest con, scam,
Thank you.
swindle, if you like, swindle.
Yeah, scam, scheme, grift, graft. What was one peanut? What has one peanut grift? I don't even know what that one is.
Peanut grifters. That's right out of the terminology of the confidence game, and I'll get to that.
Okay, so the book is DEI Exposed, and I have a super duper fresh before it even hits the press copy. So thank you so much for that. And we'll try to go over it, but you know it better than I do. So frame the story for us, if you would.
Well, first of all, we talk about DEI. It's one of the buzzwords that's in common currency and the discourse, public discourse of today. It means diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the big problem with DEI, it is left undefined. The average person probably hears the words diversity, equity, and inclusion and thinks, that sounds very enlightened. That sounds like something out of the Enlightenment tradition. And so what we have is an empty decanter of DEI, and the average person of goodwill, fairly intelligent person, pours into this empty decanter his or her good feelings and conceptions about what DEI actually consists of, but ignorant, really, of the substance of DEI and how it's actually practiced on the college campuses. And that is the topic of my book, exposing the noxious, toxic ideology that stands behind DEI and the good feelings of good people that really back it or propound it. These are basically people who are foot soldiers for a cause that they really don't understand. And I'm hoping to disabuse many of these foot soldiers of the con game. They've been swindled. They've been duped. They're stooges for and that's very unkind language, and I mean it to be so, because no one wants to be a stooge, basically a propounder, a propagator of a lie, a big lie. And when I say it's the biggest con of the 20th century, 21st century of our century, I mean that. I mean that in around 2021, DEI came onto the campuses at the invitation of administrators, fearful that the BLM riots were going to come to the campus, and they were persuaded, they being the administrators of colleges and universities, faculty, and some staff, they were convinced that they were guilty. They were guilty of rampant racism on their campuses because the con story, the false con story told by DEI people, is that America is an inherently racist country, that it is riven with white supremacy culture, and that all white people are guilty of racism, and all people of color, as it serves the movement, are victims of racism. It's an old dichotomy of oppressors and oppressed, exploiters and exploited, of evil and good. It's a very primitive dichotomy, a very primitive ideology, and people bought into it. They bought into it by people like propounding of this ideology, people like Ibram Kendi, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Ijeoma Ulua, Layla Saad, a whole Robin DiAngelo. It's a whole raft of people, gurus, propounding this fake narrative of America as a racist country, irredeemably so, and that the only people capable of providing absolution are diversity officers in the university. That's the story. That's the con. That's the swindle, and it's a very expensive swindle. And lots, millions of tuition dollars are going into the pockets of these DEI officers on the campuses.
So it has the kind of renderings of a religion, um, and you can kind of I can't think of the word. You pay like dispensations. You pay to get
Absolution.
absolutions. Yeah, there's another.
Yes.
There's another.
Indulgences.
Thank you. Thank you. Pay indulgence. Fair enough. I also have to say that I've been trying to frame this in my mind a little bit as well. I was reading the con part um, with the another grift graft scheme, which was Theranos. Only because I'm reading and writing about this potentially with John Tamney, and we have kind of a concept that Elizabeth Holmes may not have been the best person, but it kind of it took two to tango. You need somebody with this kind of dark triad of what is it?
Narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy.
Right, and so you can maybe frame that with us, and let's even if we stipulate that Elizabeth Holmes had that, it takes somebody else to kind of invest in it. Now she was there to do something good, say, and maybe 20, 30 years down the line, her idea of a single drop of blood being able to provide all these different answers might work, but there was a little bit of chicanery there and a little bit of fake it till you make it. But in this case, what was the end product? The end product for bad blood was actually good blood. Was take your blood and do something really quickly, and then have the results really quick, and so for that we'd all be better off. And it was kind of an economic thing, but you needed people to buy into it, and the image of her as this kind of shining light, kind of the female Steve Jobs, so forth. People needed to buy into it. So there has to be kind of this religious aspect, and it's really a kind of a mating and a meeting of minds, as it were, really over actual substance and reality. So, with those kind of two counter examples, A, the church, and B, kind of a scheming startup, where does DEI fall? And how did it fall into the kind of willing acceptance of those who wanted something like that to be?
Well, you've got the perfect setting. You've got the 2020 killing of a criminal in the streets of Minneapolis that's kind of set this thing ablaze, ablaze an entire country in terms of BLM riots. You've got the COVID lockdown going on at the same time. People are fearful. People are staying home. People are urged to be compliant with regard to what the government says to do. You've got a tremendous sea change in how a society is being operated. And I think that the universities wanted to avoid a lot of trouble. And so they accepted blame or accepted guilt of rampant racism, that America is a rampantly racist country riven with white supremacy culture and must be redeemed in some way. And you use the word indulgence. I use that term in the book as well. Seeking absolution. Who can provide absolution for this guilt? And that would be the DEI diversity officers who's saying, look, we can train your people to be part of a whole anti-racist contingent and transform America into the place it was meant to be. And of course, this was the story that was sold to America writ large and was sold to certainly university administrations. Oh, we just want to produce a level playing field. Oh, we just want to give everyone a fair shot. Oh, this is only about teaching about race and teaching about slavery. That's all this is. When of course it's really none of those things. In fact, the actual processes and procedures and programs on the campus designed to remedy this so-called racism have nothing to do with establishing a level playing field, and has everything to do with brainwashing or thought reform or training people into behaving as if they're mentally ill. And by this, I mean this very explicitly, paranoid personality disorder. The idea that we are going to portray the average person as a racialized being. And we believe that you can be you being either whites or non-whites, can be categorized as either villains or victims, as oppressors and oppressed, as exploiters or exploited. And this is how we believe society operates. Your primary characteristic that determines who you are and what you're going to do in life is your race. All these other things like education, upbringing, moral, secular codes of morality, religion, all of this is irrelevant. They're only minor characteristics. What stands central to your identity is your race. And we can characterize people in these two categories as either villains or victims. Now, this is very helpful if you buy into this simplistic ideology, this cult, if you will. It's very ancient. It's called Manichaeism. Manichaeism. It is basically dividing society according to a binary of good and evil. And St. Augustine was a follower of Mani and the teachings of Mani until he finally wised up and said, this makes no sense. And he moved in a different direction, as we all know. And so the idea that society is comprised of these two categories of villains and victims, this is very refreshing for a paranoid personality who sees a stranger coming toward them on the street. Ordinarily, normal people go, well, I can't make any judgment about this person until I meet them, talk with them, understand their background, understand their lived experience, understand their education level, understand how they've come to their station in life. So we suspend judgment. On the other hand, DEI racialists know exactly what this person is all about based on skin color. And they make a judgment, they being the DEI people, the racialized DEI people. This person's a white person coming to me on the street. This person is a villain. I know this for a fact because this is what my theory tells me. Or this person is a person of color, which is a contrived category because persons of color aggregates virtually every Hispanics and Asian Americans, South Pacific Islanders into this category, and they don't even know that they're in a category. And I should say also that Asian Americans are considered persons of color as it's convenient for the DEI cadre. Sometimes they're persons of color who are oppressed. Other times they're considered white adjacent, which is the term that they use, which means that Asian Americans have access apparently to the privilege and power that are supposedly afforded white people in this country. And so we find these shifting categories, but the bottom line is that you can tell something about someone by virtue of the color of their skin, their immutable external characteristics, and that's how you should behave. And this is what I mean by paranoia, because the idea of creating a pseudo community of people who are persecuting you is part and parcel of the psychology literature that paranoid people create their persecutors. And in this case, this is according to Norman Cameron, a very famous psychologist who pioneered this view, that the people out here who are persecuting me now have a face. They now have a race. They now have a color. And I can identify them very clearly through these immutable characteristics. And now I feel relieved. And I know who my persecutors are, and I know how to behave according to that. Now, you asked me the second part of the question. That was religion. And then there was the other part of the question was with respect to what?
Well, I was talking about Theranos and whether it's a proposition, what's being sold here. Theranos at least had the idea and concept of selling something for the betterment of humanity, and I think DEI does that as well. But I think it's in absolute terms, having a great blood test is kind of a more concrete aspect rather than something like this where we're, say, persecuting and prosecuting a certain fraction of your population.
Yeah, Theranos is an interesting case, and we look at that case in my business class as it's a magnificent fraud. And the idea was that maybe the technology can catch up soon, before our fraud is found out, and we can actually develop a blood testing formula that will fit into this tiny box we call an Edison, and can utilize this tiny drop of blood that we put into a nanotainer. So we can always say, well, Elizabeth Holmes, she meant well. Well, that's kind of the mother-in-law excuse or reason. Is, well, the mother-in-law did something outrageous. Oh, well, she meant well. And in this case, lives were at stake with respect to Elizabeth Holmes and her blood testing technology. In the case of DEI, we also find that lives are at stake and can be at stake with respect to this. I think the excuse that you find for DEI when you ask most people, what about DEI? And they say, oh, well, the sins of the past. Oh, well, we've got a lot to atone for. Oh, we've got reparations. And they basically point to uh, unchanging aspects of the past as being a justification for today's DEI. Now, these facts that they point to, there's no disputing them, depending on what they're pointing to. I mean, the death of George Floyd in the streets of Minneapolis 5 years ago, that's not going to change. No matter what we do today, that will never change and can always be pointed to. Selma can be pointed to. Rosa Parks can be pointed to. The Watts riots in 65, that can be pointed to. That's not going to change. Nothing. So those immutable, unchanging aspects of history can always be referred to. And the proponents of DEI always refer to that rather than the specifics of their remedies that to remedy the sins of the past or remedy these perceived flaws in American society today. And you cannot pin them down on this. I will give you an example. Supposedly DEI is going to remedy the racism in American society, and it's going to be a liberatory program, an emancipatory program. Well, I'll give you the example of Princeton University. Summer of 2020, July 4th, in fact, a letter went out from Princeton University, signed by an open letter signed by faculty and staff, accusing Princeton University of rampant racism on the campus and demanding changes be made at Princeton University, that this rampant racism must be addressed. Well, Connor Friedersdorf, a journalist for The Atlantic, did the most obvious thing in the world. He contacted all 300 or more of these signatories of this letter and asked them the most obvious question. He said, can you show me, can you give me examples of this rampant racism at Princeton University, any incident at all that has occurred in the last 15 years? Now think about that. You've accused Princeton of being a bastion of rampant racism. And so, yes, you're being asked to provide an example. They could not provide a single example, not just a handful, but a single example of this rampant racism. And yet, their demands were taken seriously, and the programs put in place to bring Princeton to heel. So I've always asked the question, who are the policies, who are the people, the policies, the procedures, and programs that you find racist on this particular campus? Be specific. Give examples, and only then can we begin to tackle this problem that you perceive. But right now, there is no evidence, there is no proof, there's no examples of this rampant racism. All we have is your con story to demand millions of dollars, and I mean this nationwide, to correct this problem that you refuse to identify and give examples of. That's a beautiful con and a great business model if you can get someone to buy into it.
Now, it's a funny thing. There's a joke. Two data scientists are walking down the street. One says, "Hey, how are you?" The other guy says, "Compared to what?" I mean, what people are always failing to realize is that humanity is kind of a broad, a broad spectrum. We get to see just kind of our little neighborhood and now whatever we see on our screens and so forth, but the stipulation is that the whites are the bad people. They're doing all this kind of racism kind of bleeds out from the white race, but it doesn't really ever explain why there are kind of I don't know, one sect versus another in Somalia, Sudan. There's huge. Remember Darfur. It was kind of like I guess kind of the Arab bunch going against the black animists and so forth, and Syria is also sectional and factional, and then China going after Tibetans and Uyghurs and whatnot. Burma, the Pakistan India war. I don't know whether you can parse out who's brown who's white in that.
Who are the good guys in all of this? Who are the good guys?
And Sri Lanka has the Tamils versus the I can't remember. Anyway, this kind of like it goes on. Tom Lehrer has a song, International Brotherhood Week, back from the 60s or 70s. But it's like everybody's going after everybody and all the time. And it's, so why single this out? Frankly, the societies in which DEI has been propounded and promoted and promulgated are frankly the kind of the least racist formulations ever been created. You go to China, um, there's nobody talks about diversity as our strength, in terms of the way we have, or Japan. Japan got very strong. They got weak for probably, kind of decrepitude, socialist, reasons, whatever, but they got strong being all Japanese. I mean, it's not like, everyone was talking, oh, we needed, some Nigerians here to make Japan better and so forth. The Nigerians, I don't think necessarily want the contrary. There's people can work together if they have a theme and so forth. But the kind of, this concept that it only goes one way, it seems to be very much self-serving. So, there's the, qui bono, who, it's not just the YouTube front man, but, who benefits from this? It always seems like no matter what the, indulgence scheme that gets put up, whether it's climate change or, one thing or another, it's like, you must be taxed more, you must pay more, and it will go to these other people. The DEI Exposed is a great title. And it's actually, happening in real life, in real time, for people who want to see it. So before we kind of get to the, potential denouement, I'd like to talk a little bit about, how you formulate your book. You have one pithy comment, which is you can't spell deceit without DEI. That is, if you spell deceit correctly. And maybe, go through some of the kind of foundational chapters and the concepts thereof, if you don't mind. I can put them up just as a mnemonic little bit here. So we have, these are kind of the basic steps here for people to follow.
Sure.
Pick and choose where you want to go with this, and we'll kind of lay out the next half hour.
With number one. Let's start with number one here, blueprint for the big con. This con game is, and when I say con game, I'm referring to confidence game, the necessity of a grifter or to obtain the confidence of a particular mark or sucker in this case, and to gain the confidence and to tell a compelling story that is designed to separate the sucker from his money. And the con in this case is called virtuous victimhood. That is a term from psychology. It's the idea that it's a resource extraction strategy where you can convince someone or a group of people or an institution that you are a victim of the people at the institution or of this person. And if you can convince enough people that you are a victim, a genuine victim, then, by the way, your victimhood gives you a certain virtue, hence the virtuous victimhood part, and that your actions can be excused and given a pass. Actions that would get you indicted were you a member of the villain class. And once you can get people to buy into this, well, then you can begin the process of extracting resources, which is basically getting payoffs to absolve you of your guilt or your responsibility. This is standard. You can go to the psychology literature under virtuous victimhood as a resource extraction strategy. I would commonly call, and Ayn Rand would call this looting. We're going to loot the universities of money that is due to us for various reasons. And it's going to be very lucrative for us and very expensive for the university. And when I say the big con, the story that has convinced these people, I mean that quite literally. It's a story of, it's a fake story. It's a story that's grounded in falsehood, and it's designed to extract the maximum amount of resources from the university. And it's been very successful. It's a great business model if you can, if you can do it and you want to be a con artist. And these grifters are the biggest con artists around. In 2021, the grifters began pouring onto the college campuses at their invitation from where they had been hanging out their shingles as peanut grifters. And now we're ready to participate in the big con. What's a peanut grifter? Well, this is a short con designed to dupe people and convince them. It's like a fortune teller. We're going to tell your fortune, and you're going to give me some money. I'm going to tell you a compelling story that's false, making it up as I go along, but I'm going to read your personality, and I can tell you a very convincing story. And this is what the DEI hustlers are doing. You are guilty. You are guilty of racism. There's nothing that you can do about this. They're speaking to the majority now of white folk. You are a victim. And there's nothing, you're a victim. It's not your fault. You may have internalized the oppressor mentality, and that's not your fault. But what we have to do is train you to understand that you're a victim, and you need to demand what's yours. You need to stand up and forget these universal values such as professionalism and punctuality and frugality. These are all white supremacy behaviors. Individualism, leave all that behind and step up and out and to take what's yours. If you're a villain, you need to step back. You need to step back, listen, and believe what people are telling you, and don't offer any kind of resistance. This is all part and parcel of the DEI hustle that we find on college campuses. This is how it works. And I think it's important that people understand this, to recognize how DEI is actually practiced on the campuses rather than defend DEI because I have a kind of an imaginary vision of what DEI actually is. And I'm going to accuse people who don't agree with me as being ignorant, when it is in fact I'm the person who's ignorant and really defending my own virtue and my own vanity because I haven't got the time or the integrity to find out what the truth is.
You know, I've had on my show G Van Fleet, and her last name is married, but I don't know what her, she's Chinese born, and she went through the Cultural Revolution and the Maoist education, re-education camps, and a lot of this, they have literal called struggle sessions and so forth, and critical thinking, this kind of this, a lot of these terms, that Marx wanted to be critical of everything. Now, I'm critical. I might go to a restaurant and think X, Y, and Z about it. Whatever. I mean, I think it's reasonable to be critical, but in this case, they're not talking about criticism the way we think of it. They're talking about criticism in the sense of kind of plowing over somebody else's viewpoint. You have to criticize them into non-existence so they can be kind of ground down and reformulated into something that you want and see as appropriate. So there's Khmer Rouge either apocryphally or literally, singled out people with eyeglasses because
that's true. I've heard the very same thing. I've read that very same thing.
Yeah, I've seen a little pushback on it, but I can't relive it. But certainly their notches on their belt were numerous, in the millions, and again, that was between brownish people and brownish people. There was no race element there. All these things tend to come down to ideology and power, and so it's a very, whatever the standard formulation that you come out with, who the enemy is, you basically are able to anneal and formulate a power against that. You form a bulwark against the enemy, and the enemy is not really there. So it's like in medieval Europe, you could kind of see them. They'd wear their banners and colors, and they maraud against each other. Thus the beautiful fortresses and whatnot, remnants, castles that we see littered across Europe. But in Cambodia, there was no need for castles. I mean, the people were the people, and they were all intermixed, and they were probably getting along reasonably well beforehand. Most of the Cambodians I met are really, kind of sweet, soulful, pleasant people, and they're, I don't know, but the thing is to find this differentiation, and so you have to make eyeglasses, or race, whatever. Jonah Goldberg, while he was kind of in the ascendancy in my viewpoint, he's kind of on his downward curve for me, but he wrote Liberal Fascism, and I think the term is an apt term, liberal fascism. Everyone thinks fascism's on the right, and nobody else can do it. It's kind of like, whites are the only people who can be oppressors. Liberals can never be fascists. But his differentiation was that national socialism was brought about because international socialism hadn't worked. International socialism was to unite all the workers of the world. Well, people had their language, they had the differentiations with it. So, Mussolini and then Hitler decided to work on the national aspect and anneal people against somebody else. And you need the other for that. And it becomes kind of a way to shimmy up the power totem pole, basically on the skulls and corpses of your enemies. And then you get power, you get the commanding height because you have this ability to villainize and deify. And it's kind of a separation technique. So I don't know, there's not really a question there, but how much of this is kind of this kind of power ascendancy aspect?
Well, I agree with a lot of what you said, if not all of it. I have to say that when you talk about fascism, fascism is not the property of the right, exclusively of the right, because Theodore Adorno is responsible for this misnaming of and misidentification of fascism as being on the right. He wrote the Authoritarian Personality back in the 50s, which became the primer of what consists of fascism. But he was looking at it as primarily a phenomenon of the right. Now, Theodor Adorno was one of the founders of the Frankfurt School's critical theory, and he was a neo-Marxist. And so, of course, he's going to define authoritarianism in a way that does not encompass his own belief system of Marxism. Now, the idea, and you mentioned something else that the idea of people's beliefs. And Marx, of course, believed that there was an economic theory, of course, of class, and he was a very important theorist in terms of class analysis, and I think that's his major contribution to the idea of looking at class as a motive force in society. But he made the terrible mistake, and it's a mistake that the DEI people make, is that this is the only force. He saw that the ideas primarily come out of the class to which you were born into: bourgeois ideas, proletarian ideas, aristocratic ideas, that kind of thing. And the idea that, well, we're simply creatures of class. And I think that the DEI people have taken that, they've bowdlerized it, they've changed it, so said that you're a creature of race, and your ideas that come out of you as a person of, say, you happen to be white, which is the idea of race is, as they say, a social construct. Well, this determines your belief system. This determines how you behave towards others, and you cannot escape that. You cannot help that. I think the example of the Khmer Rouge and the idea of Cambodia, the idea of eyeglasses, it simply identified people, I think, as intellectuals, and the intellectuals were the enemy. These were people who thought for themselves. They did not want to take this received wisdom, the wisdom that had been determined for them, because this is the great conceit of DEI. This is the great conceit of Marxism, the idea that we have discovered the secrets of history. We have peered into the contradictions of society, as Mao Zedong would have said in his famous essay on contradiction. We know what motivates society. We can see the power and the privilege and the contradictions within society. And what you must do is recognize your false consciousness and ascend to critical consciousness. So that encompasses your idea of the ascension of power, the idea that anyone who does not agree with this definition of society, or how we've defined it, which is basically pseudoscientific, and I'll get to that in a moment, but you have false consciousness. Like Randy, you and I have false consciousness, which it's tautology, which means we simply haven't ascended to critical consciousness. There are people on my campus who believe this, who think that, well, I have critical consciousness now. I have ascended to this notion of being able to peer into society. I have accessed this hidden, forbidden knowledge. There's nothing hidden or forbidden about it. It's been around a long time. It's been around since the ancient religious cleric Mani, who developed Manichaeism. And so you have these people who are basically enacting Plato's cave. They believe that they have come out of Plato's cave, and they have achieved this critical consciousness. And I do believe that it was Alfred North Whitehead who said that all of philosophy is nothing but a series of footnotes to Plato. And it was Plato who, in the Republic, came up with this notion of the cave, and the idea that we are prisoners of this ideology, we're prisoners of this vision, and we can, if only we could break free and come out of the cave, we would stop thinking reality is these shadows on the wall that are cast by people trying to manipulate us, probably those psychopaths in the dark with the dark triad. We come out of the cave. Well, this is essentially the performative dance that critical theorists have been using. This is the dance DEI folks have been using, that they have ascended to this, and they have access to this power. They have deserved this power over other people. And if only these other people can be brought to the light where they will agree with us, then we can eventually change our society. This is what Maoism was trying to do during that Cultural Revolution. The idea, instead of killing your enemies, you're going to re-educate them, and we're going to put them through these struggle sessions, which are tortured to some extent, but put through this rigorous psychological process that's going to change their way of thinking about things until they come to the light. And I believe, you're going to come to the light if you're put through enough stress and rigor with no time limit. You will say, you know what? Yeah, I believe what you're saying. Just get me out of this cell.
It's a form of torture.
Yes, it is.
Basically, I went through my own struggle session, and attempted re-education, literally, by the Board of Registration in Medicine in Massachusetts. And I don't want to devote too much time to me, but I was kind of a happy-go-lucky primary care doctor, nearly 30 years, kind of street level walk-in clinic, treating all comers and whatnot. And along the way, I started doing this adjunct narcotic detox, and I was using Suboxone to get people to sobriety. It was a pretty strict program. I used 4 months. I had to use the philosopher Goldilocks, not too long, not too short. I didn't want 3, 5, 7-day, 10-day detoxes where people bounce back, and I didn't want to keep people on methadone or Suboxone forever. So I came up with this program, and a lot of people loved it, but it wasn't for everybody. I was pretty strict. You couldn't use drugs. Anyway, cut to the chase. One of the precepts was that I saw addiction as a bad problem, as a trauma, if you will, analogously, but not as a disease per se. And every now and then I saw, enough people. I saw probably a couple thousand people over, about almost a decade, and startup and whatnot. But people would complain. I mean, even the best Marriott hotel, if somebody doesn't like something, and so the complaints are kind of magnified because they are complaints. That's that person, but you don't never see the denominator for that problem. Anyway, so somebody complained, and then they kind of hunted me, my thoughts and whatnot. And it was pretty obvious. I think there was, I always maintain that if I were from a different racial group or whatever, that my ideas would have been seen as groundbreaking. But I'm not unique in not seeing addiction as a disease. I mean, it hadn't been a disease for long periods of time. And I don't think it's helpful to see it as a disease because it's something you can't get away from and can't rid yourself from, like, I don't know, brain tumor or whatever, or diabetes. But drug addiction, you can. It's not a default situation. Anyway, so along the way, they had found I was writing on this topic, and they brought my own writing against me. So the first 3 allegations, I was temporarily suspended, was that I didn't see addiction as a disease. So it was kind of a thought process, and they were willing to let me keep my license if I re-educated. I would have to go to see these therapists. I'd have to have somebody come into my office, like once a week and monitor me and watch me at my own expense. And they wanted, me to go away for, whatever, all this kind of psychological review. They wanted me to go. Massachusetts is like the kingdom of the medical world, the medical mecca, if you will. And literally Saudis come here, so they leave their own mecca to come to ours. But I was supposed to go to Kansas for like a week and get some psychological whatever. I know everyone's got issues, but I pretty much stop at stoplights and keep my dog and household and family fed and pay my bills and so forth. No crimes, whatever. And so I became kind of this thought criminal. I wound up docketing a case to the Supreme Court. Didn't get heard this year. Which is, would have theoretically been my revenge tour. And I had my license back. All the charges were kind of meretricious and peremptory and dissolved under the scrutiny of light, but it kind of ruined my life. And I could, but all along the way, I could have kept everything intact if I just nodded and bowed and said, mea culpa, mea maxima, so forth, and gone with the current religion. And that board, I think, was validly, it was before the term woke actually happened. It was 2014. But looking back, I think this is kind of a precursor to the cancel culture aspect and getting everybody to, we saw it during COVID, that the doctors had to align with the state. There was this bill, AB 2098, I think. It never passed in California, but the idea was that, you could not practice medicine unless you adhered to whatever they said it was the thing you had to be doing. And so this is kind of this, eternal power grab. And I don't think everything's a zero sum in life. You can have a nice suit. I can have a nice jacket, whatever. And, my having one doesn't detract from yours and so forth. But rights tend to be that. The granting of rights to certain groups, it unnecessarily takes them away from somebody else. And I think this is kind of a reapportionment, a gerrymandering of rights. And so our thoughts preempt yours and yours disappear. And the kind of the denouement of all this is that the places where this stuff gets practiced is misery. Nobody wants to live under a regime where that authority is always right. I mean, that's kind of ISIS. That's kind of, Nazism. That's this and that. So, so the irony, I'm sorry for my diatribe, but The irony about the Khmer Rouge instance is they were picking people with eyeglasses because ostensibly those people could read, and if they could read, they might be able to think. If they might be able to think, they might be able to see that something was wrong. There was this East German movie, The Lives of Others, where the Stasi were getting after people who were thinking differently. But the funny thing is, here we have the universities all set up with tenure and whatnot, so that people can think differently and have the security to do so. But oddly enough, they are theoretically the ones with glasses would be gone after first if there were any kind of like their communist, Marxist neo-utopia brought about, and or they would have taken away their right to think independently. Now, none of them seem to mind. I mean, we saw this during COVID. There's kind of interesting alignment with DEI happened during COVID, where everyone was doing this kind of rote thought process, whether it was in the racial realm from George Floyd or whether in the medical realm or in the societal realm. So sorry for my diatribe, but I don't know, maybe you can respond to some or any or all of that.
Well, it's interesting. I use I love Václav Havel and his some of his works. He's a dissident, Czech dissident, became the first president of the Czech Republic.
He was a writer.
Yes, he was playwright. Yeah, he was a great one, and he wrote a very famous essay called "Power of the Powerless," and he gives this anecdote of what it's like to live in a totalitarian society, authoritarian if nothing else. He says the greengrocer who has a little shop, he's supposed to put a sign in his window. The authorities give him a sign to put in his window. And the sign this week says, or this month says, "Workers of the world unite." Now, he doesn't know what that means. He's apolitical. He just wants to sell his vegetables and make a living. But he knows that if he doesn't put that sign in his window, something bad is going to happen to him. He will be identified as someone who is a dissenter, even if he simply forgot to put the sign there. Whether he's political about these issues or not, he's going to put that sign in the window. And likewise, if you don't recite the latest mantra of diversity is our strength, that kind of mantra that's mindless and quite frankly idiotic is no, diversity is not our strength. Competence is our strength. Innovation is our strength. Creativity is our strength. Pick something that actually means something, not some arbitrary descriptor like diversity is our strength. It's absurd, and I don't say it except to ridicule it. And the fact is, it's very much like the greengrocer who puts it in his window because he knows something bad will happen to him. People on the college campuses and perhaps even in corporate America put that sign up, put up a rainbow flag over here, put up some sort of visual indicators that they're on board in Big Brother society. Now, the struggle sessions we talked about in China is the idea of putting pressure on people, and the goal is to get them to confess. And you drew a very good parallel with your own situation. They're trying to get you to confess to something. And this is identical with what happens in the States and what has happened and still happening in communist China. It's part of the re-education process. When you finally put in writing, I confess that I did something wrong, even though you know it's false, and you'll do it just to get out of this particular bad situation. Now, that's not enough. Now they want you to start, as they say, do the work of reconciliation, do the work of education. The term that you used, re-education, was coined by an American, and it didn't mean it in a bad way. We tend to think of re-education as part of, re-education camps, that sort of thing, where you can find yourself in a camp that's going to re-educate you if you're not saying and doing the right thing. Well, this came from a fellow by the name of Kurt Lewin in the 1940s, who was the father of the Encounter Group, and an MIT social psychologist. He's the guy who created the whole notion of brainwashing in utilizing group pressure. He said that you can change a person's belief system by unfreezing it under pressure, change it, replace it with a belief system that's more to your liking, and then refreeze it so that the person doesn't backslide into the old behavior. And he called this re-education. And he meant this to be kind of a positive process that could maybe take criminals and replace their errant belief system with something more socially acceptable. Well, this was used for many, many years, this idea of re-education, until, the left began to think, sounds kind of unsavory. And so we're going to change it. We're going to change it. And they changed it about the same time the Chinese went from re-education and rectification to a new terminology. The new terminology that they use, and they still use it, is transformative education. Not re-educate, but transformative education. The Chinese use the term education for transformation. So you see this parallel construction of that they're changing the terminology, not changing the actual processes, but changing the terminology so to escape the pejorative aspects and the nastiness of this idea we're going to put pressure on people to make them confess and then do the work of their new belief system. So it's a very complex and a very a place that's riven with, it's a minefield that's riven with potholes and explosives, and you can easily step wrong in such a society, in such a contrived situation.
Yeah. So I'm going to pop up a couple more of your chapters, and I've had on Wilfred Riley. I don't know if you know him, but the hate crime hoax, he covers that pretty well. But maybe we can talk about some of these other aspects. The well, I kind of, there's here you have the protocols of the learned elders of diversity. That's kind of a Nazi. Well, actually, started with the under it was under Tsarist Russia. It was the
Yes, it was.
protocols of the elders of Zion, and that was a false flag operation to vilify Jews as having had some plan. Um, but take a swipe at some of these. We're kind of in our last lap of this show, and I
Well,
want
I'll
to give
look
people
at
the flavor.
white
I'm
supremacy.
really going to go out and buy your book, but tell us.
I look at white supremacy culture, the protocols of the learned elders of diversity. The fact is that one of the primary source material that comes out of DEI programs nationwide in the colleges and universities, and I speak specifically about Michigan, Wisconsin, Boston University, the NEA, National Education Association, Duke University's medical school. These are organizations that utilize what I call the protocols of the learned elders of diversity. It's a fake list of white supremacy cultures that includes profession. These are white supremacy cultures now: professionalism, punctuality, frugality, the nuclear family, individualism. These are all supposedly white supremacy culture. Now, where'd this list come from? Well, it came from a dissatisfied, disaffected diversity worker in 1999 by the name of Tema Okun in North Carolina. With the list, did she do some research to come up with the list? No. She was angry. She was angry after having an unsuccessful diversity session when people weren't listening to her. So she came home in a fit of anger and jotted down a list of 15 behaviors that she then called white supremacy behaviors. She then took this list, it was published online. People began to pick it up. She wrote it. She went to graduate school at UNCG, Greensboro, and wrote a dissertation in 2010 with this list as the centerpiece of it. She went on to publish a book with this list as the centerpiece, and this list continues to serve as a source material for white supremacy culture in this white supremacy society that we live in. And she made it up. She even says she made it up. I cite her in my book, DEI Exposed. And by the way, here is the cover of DEI Exposed, the biggest con of the century, almost toppled higher education. The reason being that this fraud that she simply fabricated in an angry fit of rage is now still being used in colleges and universities. This is very similar to the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, which is a forgery designed to energize anti-Jewish sentiment in Russia, and is still used. It still has this kind of a currency amongst anti-Semites around the world. And in like fashion, here's a person who fabricated a list designed to fan animosity towards white people who are obviously, by virtue of the color of their skin, supportive of a white supremacy culture, which basically doesn't exist except in the mind of the person who created this. And there are actually people, and I include the dean of the Duke Medical School, who are citing this and putting their signature on it as being somehow something that we should respect and honor and perhaps even internalize.
Yeah, no, it's a funny thing you mentioned Duke. DEI is kind of a new term of art, as woke is kind of a new term of art, but these things have been around for a while. I mean, the Duke case, was it 15, 20 years ago? I don't know the number.
Lacrosse, yeah, like 2005, the Duke lacrosse
So
scandal.
20. So 20. My math's not too bad. But that's basically the same thing, where the whites had to be perpetrators because you couldn't question the black strippers story. These things were uncorroborated, and it seems we've gone backwards. There's kind of I don't know if you've heard the term magical black, the magical black. This is a kind of a movie trope and a book trope
Yes.
these days, where in the movie, basically it's kind of a Morgan Freeman, he might be a bum or homeless or whatever you want to say, vagrant, you know, disheveled and so forth. But he's going to say something that's wise, that uh, the master of the universe, class can't figure out, because he's a person in touch with reality. And invariably, it's kind of a race guilt. I mean, it's kind of racism, different racism. To attribute only goodness to a race, whatever, or only bad, it's just not really sensical. And so much of this has to. I have a piece that I'm trying to get published. It's pretty much finished, but I call it the smoking gun. It's murder rates, and some of the uh, ways we've tried to attack those things. And I think most of them have been kind of street light. The street light effect.
Yes, yes, I do. We're going to search for something under the light, because that's where the light is, right?
We've all been kind of gun controlled into, thinking that that's the answer to violence. And, violence is really obviously a cultural and personal vendetta kind of response. People have emotions and they act on one way or another, or they have group tendencies or situations or crime. And, it's not race per se, because, Latinos coming to the U.S. in the same kind of poverty extremist situations, they have a high violence rate in different areas from blacks. But it is, racial in the sense that the underlying, you can say it's income or class, whatever, the underlying middle, class, whatever, don't have a high murder rate. We have the highest kind of gun proportion ownership in the world, and really people who own guns legally, the NRA members, have never committed murders. So this is like only, the exception proves the rule. There's one case in 2014, the only case I could find of an NRA member who committed a murder. And, but it's kind of like people always just want their answer, and then they kind of backfill their stories and their narratives to do it. It just kind of, when I went to Yale 1,000 years ago, and I'm not saying there was the golden age of meritocracy, but kind of post Sputnik, there was kind of this push to get people in who were smart. So a lot of there had been quotas. My dad tried to get into good colleges when I couldn't. He got into City College in New York because we're Jewish, and that's not a race per se, but it has this kind of like eyeglasses thing, or like the Asians today, whatever. But it seems like the colleges have gone away from meritocracy, and they didn't like the legacy cases of your granddad was a Yaley or whatever. Now you are, but now we've gone to kind of different legacies. We've kind of this reverse one, which is I mean, anyway. Here's kind of the seed of a question. While I was doing the murder article, the murder rates went up vastly after the quote unquote Great Society, which was there to fix everything. The war on poverty, poverty won. It's like, we've been going, whenever we go to kind of societal war on something, it doesn't seem to work. The war on drugs won. The war on poverty won. The Great Society, another great term, doesn't seem to have made the society great term. And for the people for whom it was designed, it actually negated some of the gains that they had gotten, previously. Thomas Sowell, whom you quote in your book and I quote in my article, and I love as a writer, points out that blacks were actually, getting their greatest rate of economic growth through the 1950s, early 60s, and that has been, there's kind of a bifurcation. But for the inner city kind of blacks and so forth, they've basically agglomerated as immobile versus, say, incoming Nigerians, incoming Ghana migrants and so forth, who have done, at par with white Americans. The kind of legacy blacks have done poorly. And it seems to be like a doubling down. It's never kind of personal. You mentioned Ta-Nehisi Coates, and he figures heavily into my, article. It's kind of an essay. And he points to, he brings up Daniel Patrick Moynihan, his own huge long Atlantic article, which I don't think they would have published, but for the fact it was him and race of that length. And I'm not going to get it right, but basically, there was a tangle of perils and the tangles of pathology, I think it was, and Moynihan had the tangle of pathology. That is, there's something happening within your group that's doing things wrong, and Ta-Nehisi Coates turned it into a tangle of perils, whereas it's societal impediments that's keeping you from doing what you want. And I don't think anybody can be kept from that if they really want it badly enough. And if you have the right kind of incentives, then anybody, any race can do reasonably well. And I think we see that. But it's like, the system, but these kind of incentives to, you get more money if your dad's not at home, has created the seeds of a generational, multi-generational aspect, which, can't ever be one's own fault. Can't be, my addiction can't be because I failed. We've gone away from shame and opprobrium, and we brought on massively more drug use. One of my other topics is the fact that, we do this maintenance thing. We've made addiction a disease. We medicalize it, and we took away any responsibility. So this has been something that's been going on, frankly, since probably the 1960s and the Frankfurt School, all that kind of stuff, is to take away agency. And it's only collective issues. And collective sounds great, but it doesn't seem to operate well in society. So, sorry again, that's my second diatribe, maybe my third. But we're kind of rounding out our hour. What else would you like to touch on, or any of the things I just mentioned?
Well, something you mentioned just now, piqued my interest, because I always refer to a mentor, kind of a quasi-mentor. I never knew him, obviously. It's Frederick Douglass, who achieved great things despite being born a slave, escaping from slavery at age 12, teaching himself how to read. And one of his greats, it became one of America's, if not America's greatest orator and a beacon of freedom. He was a great proponent of pulling oneself up by the bootstraps, a man who was oppressed far more so than anyone today can even imagine. And he wrote a speech called Self-Made Men. And this was his most popular speech. I think he first delivered it in 1858, and he delivered it thousands of times, all the way up to his death. Self-made men. He says that he believed in sweat equity. He believed that most any obstacle in life could be overcome by the determined individual reaching out to change his or her fate, rather than externalizing everything that's wrong with you or everything that has happened to you as having an external source, whether it's true or not, does you absolutely no good. And this collectivist mentality is, well, they're picking on me because I'm X, Y, or Z. That is a kind of a fruitless thing to say. It's a fruitless way to respond. It may or may not be true, but you simply begin to hobble yourself with self-doubt. You hobble yourself with paranoia. They're picking on me. These persecutors out here don't know who they are, but they're against me. And you begin to imbue yourself with a kind of a grandeur, the idea of unrecognized genius, that the reason you're failing is because no one's recognizing your genius. It's not because you're not working hard enough. And this was Frederick Douglass's mantra for most anything. He said it 4 times: work, 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 work. And he said it with exclamation points, 1, 2, 3, and 4 exclamation marks after that word. That is the secret, he says. Indefatigable work. Work, relentless work to achieve your goals. And you will go over obstacles, you will go around them, you will go under them, and you will achieve your dream if you are willing to do what's necessary, rather than pointing the finger over there or over there, rather than doing a woe is me, going to happy hour and putting, crying in your drink that the life is not fair and that sort of thing. The lesson of Frederick Douglass is...
No, that's the funny thing. Getting back to my world of treating narcotic addicts, I had the sense that a lot of them went into drugs because they couldn't deal with the possibility of failure. I had, some failed potential professional baseball players, guys who had gotten to camp and all that kind of stuff, and guys who mostly, there are more guys than women in this realm, and they could have been this and that. They could have done this, but for the drugs, the drugs got them. But I think it's kind of like it's a double dip because they got the drugs that got them. And you can't really do this one without the other. And the way to do it is to, take away the things that tore you down. And it's like, I mean, every now and then, obviously somebody can get, kind of shot at random, whatever. But there's some participation, and for my own situation, I was suspended, as I mentioned earlier before. I've had a lot of time to think about that. And, being forthright is kind of my shtick. That's kind of how I roll. And if anything, I'm a little too blunt sometimes and whatnot. And that is good because I think people get the answers and so forth, but you have to be attuned to it. So you have to work on your social cues and whatnot, and whether things are done at the right time, the right place. So, that doesn't mean in this particular case, it was a felon who wrote the complaint about me. So I'm not sure that I was fully in the wrong. I think the wrong here was the board taking the word of a felon over mine. But at any rate, be that as it may, there are ways where you have to think about, how did I get in this spot? And how do I avoid getting in that spot, even if I was the right in that case? Like if you had a car accident and somebody hit you, well, fine, you were hit. But it's still a pain. You still want to avoid that if you can and not be in that particular situation. So, without scrutiny, whenever you're kind of divorced from having to make those, decisions that will give you a competitive advantage next time, then you're going to fail. And so this is the problem again with kind of the welfareization of situations. That just if you reward things that don't work, you just get more of it. And the people who get the rewards, they don't necessarily, learn anything better. And again, this is, your show, but it's a little bit of my show. So, there's a study of lottery winners, and people who win lottery tickets, big, massive winnings, their likelihood of retaining that wealth and or pleasure from it is pretty low as time goes on. And the thing is, they win it, they got it, but in a sense, their mind knows they didn't quite earn it. So you earn something, you keep it, and you have it, and plus you were building things along the way. You had to do things yourself. You have the money just show up on you. It's kind of like the arroyos out west, the water in the desert. There's a big flood, a big torrential rain, but it doesn't hit the soil. It just kind of washes off. And, the luck favors the ready and the prepared mind and all that kind of stuff. And we see this with kind of the green subsidies. You just throw money at some industry is going to turn green. Well, we see it all turns into graft and whatnot, and people have the money temporarily, like that Lao Tzu or whatever, the give a man a fish, eats for a day. This kind of turning to learn how to fish, to create for yourself is something that's missing, I think, throughout all DEI. Just because the reverse application, not just to the whites being lectured to, but the blacks who were getting this kind of benefit of everything they did was because of their skin, or everything they didn't get was because of their skin, is not really helpful towards getting them to a better place in life and or continuity if they do get someplace good.
Well, I just as an interjection here, I'd like to test out your lottery wins. I'd like to go ahead and win one of those lotteries and find out if it's true that I'm going to squander that money. I'd like to do that. But
I'll just send you a check.
The idea that there's a stigma attached to receiving something that is not earned, that is something that you have this stigma, and that people will be looking funny at you, funny out their eye, side of their eye there. I prefer not to have that stigma. I prefer not to deliver that kind of stigma. I'd like to remove that stigma if there is one, and basically reward people or see people rewarded for basically what they do in life, not for who they are, for what category they find themselves in, and for government basically labeling people so that they can divide up the spoils in the most appropriate manner possible, which again is basically goes back to Marx, the idea of having a socialist system where everyone's going to receive exactly what they deserve and work according to their need, to their means. That's the first expression of equity, I think. The idea that
unfortunately we've been getting H.L. Mencken's version. He said in the 1920s, I think, he said democracy is the theory by which people vote for what they want and they deserve to get it good and hard. That's what I think.
And Bastiat was the one who said the government is the fiction by which everyone tries to live at each other's expense.
Yeah, and that's yeah, a lot of it gets attributed as well to Tocqueville, but there's a guy, Tytler, Scottish guy, who came up with the concept that the end of democracy is when people can figure out they can vote themselves, benefit from other people's efforts. That's it kind of leads, instead of the virtuous Adam Smith circle, it leads to the kind of the vicious downward cycle. So when you burn stuff in Ferguson, when you burn stuff in Minneapolis, that doesn't lead to wealth. It doesn't lead to betterment.
Right. Yeah. You've just touched on the broken window fallacy. Again, Bastiat, the idea that you can destroy yourself into prosperity by breaking windows, and then think of who's going to benefit. Cui bono, as you said, who's going to benefit? Well, the glazier is going to benefit. The window maker is going to benefit. Think how much richer we are by the fact that someone broke this window, and now we get to fix it and build a new, missing the point that you're that much poorer because you destroyed the window, when you could have had, say, an additional raft of say tailored suits that would have increased your wealth proportionally.
Yeah. Instead of Taylor's suits, we got Taylor Swift. I'm going to remove myself from the picture for a second so people can see your great background.
Oh, look at that. I love this background. I hope that you appreciate that. This is the inner sanctum where the magic happens, where I teach. This is my office, and you'll see the book covers of DEI Exposed and my previous book, Brutal Minds. But I like to focus on the idea of DEI Exposed, which really is a very nice resource, educative resource for people. I think it's fun to read too. I think it's
No,
quite
it's a great read. It's a great read. I learned a lot of tweets. I kind of again, I'm on this potential writing about Elizabeth Holmes and whatnot. I think there was stuff bad done there. It's not just bad blood, but bad business. But this two to tango part. The investors weren't born yesterday either. So there's something about her message, or the vehicle of her as a woman founder, whatever, that kind of tingled people's dendrites in the right way, and they went for it. So I'm not trying to absolve her completely, but I think that this is going to probably get me in trouble. But the Harvey Weinstein paradigm is what I bring up. Let's stipulate Harvey Weinstein's bad man. Okay, but the women going there, until this got uncovered as a problem, when women got an invite to show up on the third floor of the Peninsula Hotel, and he's in his bathrobe, it was transactional. He delivered on the get their careers better. I don't think it was much doubt that if people showed up there, they were going to get that role they wanted. Now, should that be the way that women get roles? No, absolutely not. And if my daughter was showing up there, she wouldn't. If I had anything to say about it, beforehand. But you have to be a little bit aware that there's some kind of transactional aspect. They were hoping for gain, and terrible analogy perhaps. And he was hoping for some gain. So they did a transaction. I think it's a legal transaction. It's unsavory and so forth. With the Elizabeth Holmes story, not to make this about that, but people wanted to make money, and they thought she was the vehicle for it, and they invest in it. Now, were they deceived? Yes. Did they necessarily have to be deceived? No. They could have put a little more scrutiny into it and done their best due diligence, and they would have seen there was no there. The Wizard of Oz. So I think it's the Toto who pulls the curtain back on the wizard, and he's not a wizard. Okay, there was some wisdom there from the guy, but not a wizard. So I think when people want wizardry and want magic, they don't care to look hard. And in this particular DEI Exposed, again, you're kind of pulling the curtain back on it. But for the people who are in it, and our faculty betters at the blue chip universities and whatnot, maybe they should be blue collar. They should have known better, but they don't, and they wanted it so bad they're willing to sacrifice some of their better conceptions of what the university is and what its precepts are supposed to be.
I think that Carl Sagan really put it well in his. I can't think of the name of his book. It's an incredible book, and the quote that stands out to me is that for a magician to do his tricks requires collaboration from the audience, requires a kind of a suspension of disbelief from the audience, and the secret of evaporating the magician's power is to cease collaboration. And I think that really captures what you were just saying just now.
Yeah. So thank you very much. I appreciate you being with us I look forward to speaking with you more, and great success for your book, and great unsuccess for the proposition that you're exposing.
No, fantastic. Thanks so much, Randy. I appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you again.